Good afternoon and welcome to this week's update from Your Future Strategy. I'm pleased to advise that we've got two updates this week. One positive around the measures that the Queensland Government have come back with. They've heard the voice of the people, and I'll run through those. And also, now that we've got some details to some alternate tests that we can use to see whether people are eligible for the JobKeeper program. So let's start with the JobKeeper program and the changes that we've seen this week. The major change that we've seen this week is the introduction of some alternate tests that can be used to see if a business is eligible for the JobKeeper program. So prior to now, we knew that there would be some alternate tests released, but up until now, the measures that we've had to assess whether a business is eligible is whether their turnover has dropped by more than 30% when we compare a month such as March or April this year to March or April last year, or comparing April to June's forecast this year to April to June last year. So the alternate tests that have been introduced now allows us to compare months where we've seen that turnover reduce to either 12, 6 or 3 months prior to the reduction based on that business. We've also seen if the business started after the 1st of February, we can also look at working out a turnover per day basis and compare that to show that there's been a reduction as well. So the net has cast far wider, ensuring that more businesses will be able to access this assistance and support. And of course, the flow on from that is that people will be retained in their jobs for them to return to after the COVID-19 crisis is over. Of course, that means that there is cash flow for tenants and therefore more assistance to allow them to continue to pay the rent, which of course flows through to investors. So great news on the JobKeeper front. Looking at the other major point for this week, which is a second real positive for this week, as I went through last week, we were really concerned about the backflip that the Queensland Government had on the announcements as how we would navigate these difficult times between landlords and tenants. After a very short campaign, but a very powerful one, the Premier and the Minister of Housing really listened to all of those emails and the power of the voice of the people and revisited those announcements to come up with a new framework. So as a result of that and some pressure from the REIQ, we've become a far more balanced package, really considering both the needs of tenants and landlords. So I'm going to run through those with you now. So what has changed is that as of Wednesday night, some legislation was passed in the Queensland Parliament, which introduced some legislation and gave a head of power to the Minister of Housing to introduce a regulation, and it's known as the Residential Tenancies and Rooming Accommodation COVID-19 Emergency Response Regulation 2020. And that regulation it actually spells out the detail, or the devil in the detail, as to what we can and can't do over the coming months. The period that this regulation applies to is only out to 31 December. However, obviously, we expect that people affected won't be that long, but it's a maximum out to 31 December. So the big game changer that was introduced with the regulations was this, what's known as a show cause notice. And so what the government has listened to is that we want to know that the people that are saying that they are affected by the current times actually have been affected. And so what we now do is, if a tenant gets into more than 7 days worth of arrears, we would normally issue them with a notice to remedy breach or a breach notice. And so what we now do is issue them with what's known as a show cause notice. That show cause notice essentially puts the tenant in a position where they either need to pay the outstanding rent within 14 days, or failing that, they need to provide us with evidence, or at least communicate with us, letting us know that they are affected by the COVID-19 virus. If they don't correspond with us or communicate with us within those 14 days, then we continue with our usual process of issuing breach notices ultimately potentially resulting in us ending the tenancy as we normally would. I think this is a great introduction because it puts the onus back on the tenant to come forward and actually communicate if they are in difficulty, and then sets up a framework for us to negotiate if they need it. Without us, obviously, the last thing we'll be doing is reaching out to actually, I guess, with the tenants, ask whether they're in hardship, leading them into a position where they say, yes, I am, without actually any documentation. So once the show cause notice has been issued, we're 14 days until we know whether they either pay the rent or give us some information. The next part of the introduction is that there's two prongs to it. The first is that they need, under clause 6 of the regulations, to show that they actually, or evidence that they are actually affected by COVID-19. So this may be that they either need to self-quarantine for 14 days, so therefore they're not able to attend their regular employment. They may have someone in their family that's been restricted. They may have restrictions on travel getting to their employment. They also, their place of employment may have been shut down, or a major supplier has been shut down to their place of employment. So they need to evidence that they are affected by COVID-19 and their employment. The second prong to it is that they need to demonstrate that they are financially affected by COVID-19. And we can ask for evidence of the same sorts of supporting documents that we would ask when we go through lease application. So asking for pay slips, copies of employment documents, things of those nature, financials if people are self-employed. And that needs to demonstrate that they have had a reduction in their income of more than 25%, or that the rent is more than 30% of their income. Now, a couple of new introduced points in these regulations is that it requires a collective of all of the tenants on your tenant agreement. So if 1 out of 4 tenants in your property have lost their job, then we look at what is the total income across all of the tenants on your tenancy agreement, and has the total amount been reduced by 25%, not just 1 out of the 4, for example. So once that's been evidenced, and we've got evidence that they've been affected by the COVID-19 virus, then they are protected under these COVID-19 regulations. If they aren't, then their usual process would be followed. So if they are, and they meet those 2 criteria, then we move into a phase of negotiating a variation to the lease. Now, earlier the government had talked about waiving rent and stipulated it needed to be a waiver of rent. That's no longer a requirement, and it really comes down to a case-by-case basis. What really is their circumstances, and looking at what is the options to negotiate between the owner or landlord and the tenant. So, as I said, it can be either a waiver or a deferment, whereas before it was stipulated that it needed to be a waiver. So this has some implications for it, which I'll talk about shortly in terms of landlord insurance as well. As earlier stipulated, right back at the beginning, if somebody can prove now that they are affected by COVID-19, there is a moratorium on evicting them from the property, and that still applies. As I mentioned with landlord insurance, one of the things that this now changes is that when we do, if we have some tenants that are affected by COVID-19, and we go through the process and negotiate a variation to the lease based on some new terms, because we've potentially deferred rent, and we have some terms around how that rent will be paid in the future, and it may be that it's repaid over a period of 3 months or 6 months. We've got some terms or conditions that we can then enforce, and because of that, we are reserving your rights or preserving your rights under your landlord insurance policy. And so, for example, if we got to the end of that term and the tenant, failed to pay under the new, varied terms that we've agreed to, then we can breach them for that and follow a process to recover that. If we can't get those funds from them, of course, as normal, your landlord insurance would pay out on a loss of rent. So it's powerful that has really been reinstated based on looking at being able to defer rent rather than waiving it. Earlier, the government was looking at doing extensions for any leases that expired within the COVID-19 period. Now that's been reduced to only extending out to 30th September. So if we have a set of tenants that have a lease expiring in the COVID-19 period, then they will be able to opt to extend their lease up to the 30th September on the same terms. Whereas before, a tenant had the right to refuse entry, and that included, or at least it wasn't clear whether the tenant had to cooperate with doing a virtual routine inspection. That is now clear that they must cooperate with doing a virtual routine inspection. However, there's some pretty practical rules which are common sense, that we can't force a tenant to incur any costs by buying equipment or any of those things in order for us to conduct those routine inspections. The app that we're using is very simple. There's no cost involved, and is very is very compatible with lots of different devices. So it'd be very rare that we couldn't use some equipment or devices that our tenants already had. We've already started, we've issued entry notices, and we are already underway conducting virtual routine inspections. Our first round of those will commence on Wednesday next week. With a break lease, these rules have also been varied significantly from the earlier announcement, and so in order for a tenant to break their lease, if it's a fixed term lease, as most of them are, they need to evidence that they have had a reduction across the whole, all tenants on the lease, of more than 75%, and that they have less than $5,000 in savings. And so you can really see that we really want to understand that somebody's in real financial hardship as a result of this, rather than being able to break the lease with no evidence. So that wraps up the Queensland Government regulations that have changed. Personally, as I said, I think they're a much more balanced view between both the tenant and the landlord, and really preserve, I guess, or protect the landlord, which the early announcements certainly didn't. In terms of property management, I've already mentioned we are booking our virtual routine inspections, and the first round starts next Wednesday. We're also continuing our communication program with the tenants, and there is now a guide which I've included on the email that I've sent out, that gives some scenarios for people to understand how the regulations apply, so it's an easier read than going through the legislation for both landlords and for tenants. So that wraps up this week. The usual disclaimer, the information that we've used is publicly available information. As always, it's important to see how it applies to your own personal circumstances, particularly as I referenced today with landlord insurance, because those policies and the wording in those policies are different from the different product issuers. So you need to consider that in the context of your own circumstances. Thank you for this week, and I'd like to pay a special mention to the Anzacs for tomorrow, and hope that you all have a safe and happy weekend.